And now, you're tuned into RBLR, the home of Tampa Bay's Reveler Sports.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning into your RBLR Rays podcast. I'm Ben. Zach is not here today. Maybe we fired him. I don't know, administrative leave, something like that. But in his place, we have a very special guest. I'm trying not to fangirl too much over here. But we have, from the Rays, Mr. Neil Solondz. Thank you so much for coming on. How are you doing today?
You got it. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. And I hope your cohort is just taking a day off.
Oh, yeah. He's not really in trouble. I've been in trouble before, but so far, so good for him. We're just really excited to have you on, talk about the Rays here. I know we've got a lot of cool things planned, so I'm ready to jump right into it. No listener questions today, no curveballs, so maybe next week we'll bring that back. But we've just had so many great extensions lately, like the Yandy extension, Springs, Fairbanks, Jason Adam extension is rumored. Don't know how much that's a possibility, but there's some really great news happening lately in Rays baseball.
Yeah, I think obviously you'd like to keep your core as long as you possibly can. And the fact that the Rays now have 8 players signed for multiple years, it's probably the most I can recall. And, as I get set for my 12th season with Tampa Bay, and it's rare for a team to be able to do this, especially in the position that the Rays are in. But the fact that they are speaks to, I think, a lot of different factors in the way the sport is going, but also the confidence they have in the players they have. And also, I think from a player perspective, you have a group of guys who wanted to be here. And, I think that spells out in the fact that these extensions have come down lately.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, they do seem like they really want to be here. And I think part of that is the winning culture they've been creating basically at every level of the minor leagues over the last couple of years. I was looking at some Baseball America stuff in preparation for this. And of course, the Rays, as a minor league organization, led all of baseball in run differential in 2022 across the minors. And their domestic teams had a 604 winning percentage, which was the best as well. So, I mean, they're winning at every level. They always preach that winning is development. And with all the minor league coaches and stuff I've heard on your podcast, it seems like, the coaches buy in, the players buy in, and now we have these really fantastic results.
It's about culture, and I think it begins from the top down. And I think that obviously from the Rays era, from 2008 all the way to now, the Rays have been one of the 5 winningest teams in the sport over the last 15 or so years. And the only way a franchise like the Rays, I think, can be successful is by having that constant funnel of players. You have to probably get them through 3 different pools. You have to be able to get them through the U.S. domestic draft. You have to be able to sign players internationally to have a chance to be successful. And you have to make your fair share of really good trades because, I think it's pretty clear that you're not going to be able to more often than not dip your toe or be able to carry a lot of players through free agent acquisitions. You have to be able to get them predominantly through the 3 buckets I mentioned. And as long as the Rays continue to do that, they're going to have a lot of success. And that's the big reason for me why they've been, that in their culture, that they've been in the postseason now 4 years running and hopefully 5 this year.
Yeah, I'm really hoping it's about to be 5 years in a row. You mentioned, the different avenues, the way that the team can improve and they can acquire players, develop players. Something that, a lot of fans seem to not love is the lower payroll that the Rays typically, run year after year. But it does kind of force them to be creative and they get, they're very creative with how they operate, making sure their roster is truly, 26 men deep instead of just, you've got your starters and your bench guys. It's like everybody's contributing. The coaches believe that, the players buy into it. And like you said, the top down, it's really impressive. And it's pretty admirable because across pro sports, I feel like maybe I'm a little biased here, but I don't know if we see this, in all the pro sports. I think the Rays do a really great job of kind of embodying that everybody is important from players A through Z. Doesn't matter if you were first round pick, undrafted free agent, international signing, acquired in a trade as a player to be named later. everybody matters. So I think it's a really admirable thing, and it shows up on the field too with all this success that they've had.
I think you're right. I think it goes beyond every player on the 26-man mattering. I think every player on the 40-man matters. I think, every player that comes in Major League spring training camp and even those beyond it matter because they all have some chance to help. I mean, I don't think it was the goal coming into last year, the year prior, but the Rays would have their top 2 years in terms of players used. And a lot of that was due to, some of the injuries that were incurred on the pitching and the position player side. And you're going to have injuries, but the Rays last year were, for instance, the most injured team, in the American League and one of the top 3 in the sport. And, obviously getting back to the postseason, it's not a formula you want to follow year by year, but having that depth is critically important to be able to overcome those types of things. I think you can look at some of the teams in this division, and I don't know that there's a team that's as deep as the Rays are. Other teams have probably more top-end talent, but I think the Rays have had depth of talent. That's what has allowed them to be successful in a 162-game season. I do think that they are starting to have some top-level talent across the top of their roster, and I think that will help them hopefully in future years, beginning with this one in the playoffs.
Right. I mean, they definitely seem like they want to keep that core of, that higher end talent intact for years to come. And, I have a little bit of stuff I want to talk about with that core, but I do want to circle back to what you said about, not just the 26-man roster mattering, but like every player is treated with, dignity and they feel like they matter. You had Aaron Slager, sorry, on your podcast back in March of last year, and he talked about this really well. And I thought it was interesting that he didn't take a dig at any other organization, but just you could hear it in his voice that the excitement he talked about, being part of this organization where everybody matters and everybody's a priority. They have clear targets on what they want you to do. There's no moving goalposts, and he's actually he's kind of like a gift that keeps on giving because he helped recruit Jason Adam, if I'm correct. Mm-hmm. I believe you mentioned that last year. So, treating players the right way is not just, it doesn't just feel good, but it's helping them win. And word is kind of spreading around the league. So it's really awesome to be a fan of this organization. And I'm sure it's great to work for them as well, too.
It is. I think they're really transparent and they do care about their people, too. I think anyone who's listened to Dave and Andy and myself over the years, I think we get along well, and because we have a really good environment around us, not only the 3 of us collectively, but Chris Miller and Becca Carney and our communication staff and the way baseball operations works with us. I mean, all the way across the board, I think it all matters, and we have the freedom to discuss topics and a trust. And I think that translates to what you mentioned about Aaron, who, by the way, recently announced he was moving on. Injuries had ended his career, but I think his story is one that resonates in that, if you're a minor league free agent and you haven't found some level of success, especially as a pitcher, I kind of believe that this is the place to go. I can use Aaron as one of countless examples of guys who suddenly found a different gear. And Jason Adams certainly is another one from this past year who, because of a number of reasons, one, I think the coaching is second to none. And that begins with Kyle Snyder from a pitching coach standpoint, but all the other people around him that do such a wonderful job. But I think also they simplify the message in a way that's really easy to digest. And they focus on what you do well instead of what you don't. And I think it's anyone who's worked in a field, if you're hired and they say, we like you because of this, it probably leads you to feel a little bit better about yourself than if you started with a new company and the first thing they said was, you're good, but you need to do this to really become good. It's probably going to make you a little more self-conscious, a little bit of, well, why am I here? And I think the way the Rays utilize players, they put those players in the best position to succeed, build up their confidence. And I think especially from a pitching standpoint, it's had a lot of success.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just listening to Kyle Snyder and Chad Matola speak with you on your podcast, a lot of the things that they embody are considered best practice in education. Like I'm a teacher, a middle school teacher. I know the power of focusing on a student's strength. I know that, if you are calm, level-headed, and clear with your message, you get a lot farther than the reactive, micromanaging type of coaching. So yeah, coaching, teaching, it goes hand in hand, and it's really cool to see that, because there are things that I know that work, and to see that happen at this organization at the major league level and all throughout, it's really impressive. So I think it really helps with that winning culture, and then it's kind of snowballs from there, because if you're winning, you want to show up to the ballpark, you want to be there, you want to work for these guys, you want to run through a wall for your coaches, and then eventually you'll sign these long-term extensions if the stars align. So it's great that the Rays are starting to keep this core together with these extensions, and kind of dating back to Brandon Lau. I think it was 2018, 2019, he signed his extension. He was one of the first, and now we've got, Yandy, we've got Wander. So lots of strong core pieces, and I'm just excited to see what they can do, assuming everybody's healthy this year, and putting it all together.
And that's a big part of this, right? I mean, I think a reason that the organization got to the postseason, but also still won 86 games last year, is because they didn't have Brandon for half a year. They missed Wander for half a year. Manuel Margot, another player who was signed to a multi-year deal, was probably having the best start to any season he's had as a big leaguer. And then he hurt his hamstring, and then he came back and hurt his knee. And I don't know that he was quite the same player thereafter, but I would assume with a full offseason, well, hopefully he's back to that form. Yandy probably had one of his better seasons. But, if you have the three players we mentioned healthy for a full year, and you get a healthy Randy Arozarena and a healthy Yandy Diaz, now it starts to take pressure off some of the other guys and makes them even more secondary in terms of what you need out of them. And if Isaac Paredes continues to evolve and grow as he did last year, now he's maybe your sixth or seventh weapon from an offensive standpoint. And then all of a sudden, the bottom group, whether it's the catchers, whether it's Jose Siri, whoever it may be, that's not a ton of extreme pressure on that. And another individual I should have mentioned is Harold Ramirez, who also thrived in the environment here, and really did well. And it may not be the sexiest lineup, in terms of on paper, but it's also the same core that scored 200 runs more in 21 than they did in 22. And I think if they're healthy, they're probably going to be in between those two numbers. And if they score 100 more runs this year than they did a year ago with same guys staying healthy, and they pitch the way they have the last several years, it's going to be a team that wins 90 plus games. And I think I don't like to overcomplicate it. I kind of believe that the offense is healthy, much more healthy than last year. They're going to produce. If they're more like they were in 22, they may not be as good numbers wise in terms of runs produced, but it's going to be more than enough to win a lot of games.
Yeah, I mean, we were missing like basically the entire spine of the team, with Kiermaier, Brandon Lau, Wander, Zanino, like all missing significant time last year. So of course the offense is going to take a step back. And I'm kind of right on that same page with you, where, if these guys are healthier than they were last year, like we're in a pretty decent spot. I know that the goal of the organization, or one of the goals of the organization, is to get as many bites at the apple as they can in the postseason, and I think that strategy holds up pretty well. We've seen it work the past 4 years, hoping to make it a fifth year, but part of that is the keeping the core together. I know that they've mentioned the continuity is important lately, as one of the reasons for all these extensions, and it kind of shows historically with other teams. Like, I'm not going to say this core is as good as the Astros, but they've kept that core together pretty well, with, Carlos Correa leaving recently. But for the most part, that core is intact, and they've kept them together, and the success they've had is not an accident. So I think keeping this core together is a really good start, and I'm excited to see what they can do moving forward.
And I think if you probably compare it to another small market or smaller revenue team, Kansas City probably applies. I mean, they had the back-to-back World Series and won the second time, but you take a look at the group they had, where there was Hosmer and Moustakis, and probably they were a little more position player heavy on that side in terms of keeping a core. And they had a dynamic bullpen at the back end without really having great starting pitching. It was more they were really good defensively. Their offense was good enough and probably got hot at the right time. Their starting pitching kept them in games, and then their bullpen was so dominant that as long as they were even or within a run, they had a chance.
Right. No, I mean, that totally makes sense. And I also think of another core with the Giants in like the early 2010s. Like they kept those guys together for a while. Even the Rangers had a bit of a run where they made a couple World Series appearances. So, nice to have John Daniels coming over and giving his insight on that. But I was looking at the numbers since 1994 when the postseason expanded to 3 rounds. And since then, 11 organizations have sent 40 of the 56 World Series teams. So, almost 30% of the league, because I know the league expanded in 98, have sent over 70% of the teams. So, if you're looking for continuity and you're looking to keep a strong core together, it's shown historically that it works out pretty well, because these are cores of, like, we have the strong Yankees teams of the late 90s and early 2000s, similar with the Braves with the late 90s. Like, these are teams where they kept guys together and they had a lot of life experiences together and a lot of playing experiences together. And it showed up. I know that, World Series appearances aren't the only way to measure that, but it's pretty telling when, when a third of the league is essentially making up, 70% of the teams that go to the World Series.
It matters. It does. And I hope it matters for this group. I think you can look at some other teams in the league. I mean, Cleveland added Josh Bell, but really their core is the same as it was a year ago. And it may change dramatically over the next couple of years. They've got Jose Ramirez in place, but they may have to make some changes. Houston lost Justin Verlander, but they brought a good portion of the team that they won the World Series with last year. The Yankees didn't make many dramatic changes either. I would say of the teams that made the playoffs last year, Toronto and Seattle had their fair share of change on the roster. It's hard to say how much better or worse they are yet. I kind of want to see what health plays into it. But I mean, when you look at the 6 teams that made the postseason last year, they're not that different, at least in the American League. And I would say some of the National League has probably had more change and turnover in terms of roster configuration, but by and large, the AL teams, it's really the teams that were below that line that probably made the most dramatic change. And we'll see how much it pays for, let's say, the Angels or Texas, or whether those teams got good enough to take that next step. I think like Baltimore made moderate changes, if at all. I mean, Jordan Lyles was, replaced by Kyle Gibson, who's probably a similar type guy. I mean, Adam Frazier takes the spot of Rougned Odor, different types of players, but, not extremely different roles. And the young players will get, another year of experience. And we like to, I think Dave says this a lot. The big question is always, when you keep a core together, do the players get a year older or a year better? And I think a lot of that will determine success rate for a lot of these teams.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Isak Paredes is one that kind of sticks out as someone that, he established himself pretty well. And I know Bendix and Neander have talked about that too. But I think he's someone to, keep an eye on as a guy who's probably going to be a year better. He really kind of took he took that position on the roster just because he played his way into it. Like, I know he started in Durham, but he really earned it. So it was cool to see that. And I don't know. I think when you mentioned Toronto as a team that had a shakeup, it's interesting because, we see the continuity is so important. So we'll see how they do. I'm definitely interested to see where they end up by the end of the year with all their change. And, acquiring Kiermaier the way they did. He was probably my favorite player on the team. I've given myself a Kevin Kiermaier stick and poke tattoo. It's permanent. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm excited to hopefully see him do well. Hopefully Toronto doesn't do too great, but the jury's still out on that. So, in terms of oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, they definitely got better. I think they got better defensively, maybe a little bit on the bullpen side. I'm not sure. I think they took maybe a little bit of a step back offensively, and it really will be okay. Does the run prevention that they get, does it make them so much better that if they lose, are they losing just a little bit of offensive production, or is the gap much greater than we think? And, I think the big question is whether KK and Springer can stay on the field, because you look at that team right now, and I guess if Whit Merrifield is playing the outfield, he's not playing second base. He would be your fourth outfielder. And then Nathan Lucas, who is, a cast off from the Rays, is your fifth option right now. So it's not a team with a ton of depth in terms of the outfield play. So I'm kind of curious how that plays, just because of Springer's history and KK's history.
Right. It does seem like that kind of shifted strategies from, more of an offensive team to maybe, getting better defensively, kind of filling those holes and maybe focusing on run prevention. So we'll see how it goes. I'm usually a fan of, sticking with a strategy over multiple years. Like, for example, like when I have my students take a test, like I tell them a strategy is not Christmas treeing the test, but to pick the same answer over and over again, because you'll eventually get one right. So, I think sticking with your strategy is a good strategy. So I'm glad the Rays definitely employ that with their approach to the postseason. But I think it does take a little bit longer for younger players and prospects even to kind of get integrated into that core, because first of all, they've got to clear a spot on the roster. And then second of all, like you said before, you want them to get a year better, not just a year older. So it's going to be interesting to see who can kind of make that next step and get into this core of players and, maybe earn themselves an extension.
And I think that obviously a lot of this is dependent upon other areas, but we started by talking about health. If Wander stays healthy, if Brandon Lau stays healthy, if Manuel Margot is healthy, what it allows is that you don't need as many of the young players to all emerge. If, let's say, there's a group of 6 to 8 young players and 2 or 3 of them pop, then you're still a lot better off if your core players are healthy. If, let's say, those core players aren't healthy, then maybe you need 4 players to emerge among your younger group, which, again, is going to be harder to do. And I think part of the reason that the Rays have been as good as they have been from, 08 to now is that, generally speaking, they haven't required more than a couple of young players to take a big step forward each year. It's been maybe, okay, they added a starting pitcher who's got to step up. You had those years where James Shields was gone and now so-and-so has to step up. And then David Price moves on and there's one starting pitcher behind him. And, the same would carry over on the relief side. And I think the same on the position player side. And as long as you have a group of that funnel, if you're squeezing 1 or 2 or 3 out of the funnel, it's a lot easier to be successful than if you need 4, 5, and 6 per year.
Right. No, that totally makes sense. And it seems like they were maybe hoping that Josh Lowe could take that step forward last year. They moved on from Austin Meadows. They got a great player in Paredes who did take that next step and kind of established himself. Do you think we could see Josh Lowe possibly establishing himself this season? I mean, they had him make the team out of spring training last year, which was great. And they didn't really go after I mean, they did go after left-handed bats, but they didn't, overspend or overcommit to anybody. Do you think that's because they are going to give him a shot, and maybe Jonathan Aranda a shot as some left-handed bats that, could work their way in, maybe play a larger role than they did last year?
I think in an ideal world, the Rays probably would have added some sort of veteran to, make sure that they had enough buffer. And, I think Josh will get an opportunity. Jonathan Aranda will get a chance. I would certainly think Vidal Brujan would get an opportunity. And Probably even Luke Raley, who's out of options this year, will also get the chance to make the club out of spring training. And whoever they choose among those four, I would think two of them end up making it if everybody is healthy. Then, those individuals will get a chance. I think, ideally, whether it was a Michael Brantley or a Brandon Belt, who was clear they showed interest in both of those guys. But they also weren't going to go over the top. I thought the market this year, and I think maybe that's part of the reason you ended up with some of the extensions you did, because the market was I thought extremely overpriced. And in the case of Michael Brantley, to get him, he wanted to stay in Houston, so you had to probably go well above and beyond the 12 million plus 4 million in incentives that Houston provided. And Belt was coming off a 600 and change OPS year, which was well below league average. Yes, there were some underlying things that showed he could bounce back, but at what cost? If he got 9 million and change from Toronto guaranteed, does that mean you had to go higher than that? Is that worth a guy who was a 600 and change OPS on the open market? I think the Rays would have added in the right circumstance. And I think they were reasonable with, their approaches. And I think also on the trade market, you really haven't seen many trades this offseason by any team. And I think in large part, that's because so many teams went gaga over the free agent market. And it just happened to be a year where there was not a lot left-handed that I think that you felt really comfortable going after. It wasn't like there was a Freddie Freeman out there, who obviously the Rays made a huge pitch for a couple of years ago. There wasn't that individual out there on the market that you could say, oh, he can take this team or this position from X to X plus whatever. You couldn't, say without question, this is a major, major jump from where you were. And I think part of that is just the way things worked out this year. And I don't know. I think the other thing that's important is the game is changing this year. And a lot of that had to probably go into the way the Rays looked at players, evaluated players. And I think that we'll see how it plays out. I think, the way they estimated things, they had to figure in the shift changes. They had to figure in the base running changes. You have to figure in, how all of it is going to be altered. And I honestly think a younger team may be more beneficial than an older team, whether you're a hitter that wasn't used to having to, play as fast at the plate, or probably more so a pitcher who may have worked at a much slower tempo and now all of a sudden has to speed things up over time. With so many young players dealing with the minor league rules the last couple of years, I would think that the Rays and other young teams are probably well positioned.
Right. No, that makes sense, because the Rays have had strong minor league teams. Obviously, we talked about that earlier. They're winning at every level, and these are guys that have kind of been like the core of their minor league teams, like Josh Lowe, Jonathan Aranda, Vidal Brujan. They're not just like some prospects that, shot up through the system and are knocking on the door of the big leagues. They've worked with these, they've played together for a long time. And I think there's value in that kind of continuity as well at the minor league level. And that might be part of the reason why the Rays do like to hold on to their prospects to some extent. I know some fans have said it's prospect hugging, but I think they value their guys internally a bit more than other teams because of that continuity. And we kind of saw that at the major league level, I think, with Kevin Kiermaier. Obviously, he's a fantastic defender, but it was before the lockout, there were those rumors with him in the Phillies, and whatever the Rays asking price was might have been too high, I guess, because those talks kind of fell apart. But internally, like, Kiermaier is part of the core, or he was part of the core. He's not the best hitter, he's not the best defender anymore, but he has value because he was part of that that group of guys that had been to the postseason multiple times. So I think we kind of might see a similar thing with the prospects. So I wish there was like a stat to measure continuity, but maybe they have something internally. I'm not sure.
Well, I think it matters. I do think it does. I think also it's, how you value or evaluate your players is really important, and a big reason why the Rays have been successful, because I think by and large, they've been pretty good about self-evaluation. And I think, in any field of life, whether you're teaching as you do, or whether you're broadcasting, whether you're in sports, you have to be a good self-evaluator to get better. And I think overall, the reason the Rays have been in the playoffs and positioned themselves well is because they do a pretty good job self-evaluating. Now, they're not perfect. I don't think any franchise is close to that, but the Rays have, probably because of the resources they have and the payroll they carry, less margin for error than most. So they have to be right more often than not. And I think, they've adapted over time. They've changed, but I think their core principles have stayed intact.
Right. Yeah. I think if you have that, overarching objective of we want to have sustained success and get as many shots at the World Series as possible, and then kind of work backwards from there, I think it makes sure everything is aligned and you're not trying different strategies within your strategy, and you're sticking to your guns, and it's been successful for them. And one of those things is, we've said it multiple times here, but keeping that core together, and that Yandy extension makes me kind of wonder, how do you think they evaluate, Curtis Mead? Because I know he's someone that is likely slated for that kind of role where Yandy plays, where it's like a third base, but he could play first base kind of option. I know Mead could play some second. But what do you think the Yandy extension means for a guy like Curtis Mead, who's pretty close to playing at the big league level after a great season in Australia?
I don't know that it really changes anything. I think that if, and Eric Neander and Peter Bendix have all said this over time, that if they feel a young player is ready, they're not going to block him. And the fact that Yandy can play first, third, and DH, and that Curtis can play first, second, third, and DH, I don't think changes the fact that when he's ready, he'll be there. And I think same goes for Kyle Manzardo, who's a first baseman in DH. If you have, those are first, third, and DH are 3 spots. And if all 3 guys are really that good and really that have that ability to help a franchise win, then they'll all be in there. And they'll find a way to maximize how they utilize them. But I still think that, in Curtis's case, he didn't have a ton of time in Durham last year, and he finished the year with a health issue. In Kyle's case, and I'm anxious to see both of them in spring training a great deal, Kyle still has just a month of time in Double-A. So, I'm kind of curious how quickly the Rays push those guys. I think what it shows is they valued what Yandy brought, and the fact that if you had to pay for Yandy on the open market with today's market, you probably would have to pay a lot more than the Rays probably paid for him. And I think realizing that and knowing how comfortable Yandy had become in this organization, that he wasn't losing a step either physically or at the plate in the last several years. In fact, you could argue maybe he was getting better, that why not keep that player for a few years and maximize a guy who, again, if you had to pay for Yandy on the open market on a 3-year deal, what would he be worth? Probably at least $40-45 million in today's, a guy who could be a 380 to 400 on base, in today's day and age. Take a look at what, I'm not comparing him as a hitter to Michael Brantley, but, he's younger and he's been more durable. So would he be getting 14, 15 a year on the open market? Perhaps. And because he's in that arbitration period / free agency, they got him for 3 and 24. To me, if he's as healthy as he's been the last couple seasons where he's played 130 plus games, he's going to be more than worth it.
Right. Yeah. Similar to Michael Brantley, like Yandy is a really tough out, and he's also dependable. Like, I know Brantley has had his health issues, but you know what you're getting from Yandy. And as much as exciting as Curtis Mead is, we don't really know what we're going to get from him. Like, he's an unknown, he's really just an unknown, and we don't know, is he going to bust? Hopefully not. I hope not. I hope he turns out to be a great, franchise player for years to come. But there's always that chance. So I think taking the, a guy that's established, part of the core, keep him, at a team friendly deal, it's a great value. Same with Springs, and Fairbanks is a great deal. I think Fairbanks is one of the best, if not the best, relief pitchers in the game, and he's on a great deal too. So, there are so many exciting players that we have on the team and exciting prospects, but we know that, the prospects don't always work out. So it's nice to have all these pieces kind of locked up. And I do want to mention I messed up and said Mead was in Australia last year. I was thinking of Caminero, who was fantastic, but Mead did play in Australia a couple of years ago. So
And
just
he's
wanted to
from
correct
Australia.
myself on that. Yes. Yeah, I was hoping to see him play for Adelaide in this past season, but I know the health wasn't really working out. But it's going to be nice to see him in spring training. That's for sure.
And we'll see him a fair amount. I think the original plan when I talked with Curtis after he was added to the 40-man was not only hopefully to play a little bit of winter ball, but also play in the WBC. And I think he and the Rays came to what was a reasonable conclusion that coming off the injury he had, they'd rather have the ability to monitor him up close, not have to ramp up as fast, to have a normal spring. And as young as he is, he's going to have chances to play for Team Australia in future WBC events, I would think for sure. And this way, his first major league spring training is uninterrupted and unimpeded, and they are, able to spend as much time with him as possible. And I think that's probably best for him. It's probably best for the organization and probably best for his long term too.
Oh yeah, I think it's going to be great for his development to get that work in. Being around these guys and at a major league camp, I think that's it's really beneficial. Someone that got an extension, Jeffrey Springs. I know you talked to him on your show. He didn't really have a full spring training last year. I know he was working his way back from that ACL thing. So I think it's going to be interesting to see him in a full spring training. Maybe he can up his workload this next season and go from there. But are there any other guys you're excited to see in spring training?
I mentioned Kyle Manzardo just because I haven't seen him in person. I've talked with him multiple times, and he seems, everyone tells me about his ability to, bat to ball skills. I'm anxious to see how Taj Bradley has matured and grown on the mound. I hope that the Rays don't need him immediately at the start of the year. I mean, you're talking about a rotation, if healthy, of Glasnow, McClanahan, Springs, Eflin, and Drew Rasmussen, which could be as good as any in the sport. What that does is not only does it extend those players and allow you to keep hold of them and have team control for a couple more years at least for all of them, but it also means that you hopefully don't need Taj Bradley immediately. You hopefully don't need a Luis Patino immediately, and those guys can continue to grow. Even a Yanni Chirinos, you could decide if you want to put him in the bullpen and have him be a multi-inning guy like Jalen Beeks was last year and convert him. But you also have the chance to say, okay, let's lengthen him out. Let's pitch him every 5 days. And we'll have hopefully depth, because in most cases, your 5 starting pitchers, I think Adam Berry of MLB.com did a piece about the last time that the Rays had 5 guys throw, 25 plus starts. It's been like a decade. So it's rare just because one guy is always not going to be healthy, and you're going to need at least 6, 7, or 8 guys to be starting pitchers. But hopefully it provides you the freedom to allow these guys to even develop further, where, when they do take those next steps, they're able to impact you even in a much greater and more positive way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'd hate to throw Taj Bradley into the fire like before he's ready. So it's nice that they have this depth and the versatility. Um, Someone else who I'm excited to see, hopefully not get thrown into the fire too soon, is Mason Montgomery. I really like that delivery. It's super deceptive, hides the ball well. His stock went up a lot this past season with the way he pitched in the minors, ending up in Montgomery. So really excited to see him. Yeah, I mean, we're gonna have a relatively healthy team heading into spring training. I know injuries always happen, but the reports on Brandon Lau have been good. Wander Franco with his hamate, that's been good too. So hopefully we can kind of hit the ground running right out of spring training and do some damage in the first half, and hopefully this offense, which I feel confident they will be, but hopefully they are able to be at least a little bit better than they were last year.
Yeah, and again, if they're in between 21 and last year, I think they'll be fine. They don't need to be exceptional, but they need at least to be a league average group. I think if they do that with exceptional pitching and hopefully defense, that's back to where it, had been in previous years. They've got a chance to be really, really good. I think this year, I think the Rays have announced, at least as we record this, 75 players in big league camp, and that probably sounds like a big number, but in a WBC year where you're going to have players going in and out of camp, it's probably a reasonable number to hold and have extra guys. And the Rays are always going to be careful stretching out their starting pitchers. Usually that first week of the regular season, guys are still in that 5 to 6 inning area, and they usually keep that for a fair amount, and want as many relief pitchers to be able to throw multiple innings as conceivable. So, I think the more arms you have in spring training, the more bodies you have in spring training, the better. Hopefully that protects guys in March. That allows you to be successful in April through September and well into October.
Right. And I think, not that it's a benefit here, but a silver lining of the injuries we saw last year is, I think the staff as a whole maybe learned some lessons about workload management and, the guys that are coming off injury, like how can we plan ahead to keep them fresh? So I think, while it was a down year for the offense and the injuries were frustrating at times, I think we're going to see them hopefully with their, new knowledge of, not just what we know about injuries, but how we've experienced them and gone through them. And that's important for players too, to kind of get that peace of mind of like, okay, they've been here before, they know how to help me with this, and they can move forward. So yeah, I keep saying it, but I'm excited for this season.
Well, some of it last year too was A, freak stuff, and B, was a factor of the lockout. And when I say a factor of the lockout, that's twofold. One, you had only a 3-week ramp up. And while guys can say they were in, prep for the regular season mode, it's still different than having a 6-week spring training. And maybe we learned that for some guys, they do need a 6-week spring training. And maybe it led guys to try and almost play catch up instead of, having individuals around them and keeping a close tabs. And I think the other piece of it is that the lockout prevented the Rays from doing their normal work with individuals. They usually have a lot of contact with all of their players, position players and pitchers. And the lockout prevented them from doing that. And I know they went back to their normal practices this offseason, and hopefully that constant contact of checking in on guys, and whether it was recovering or rehabbing from an injury or just checking out their workload or sending video of some of the things that they're doing and be able to monitor that, or going and, Kyle Snyder usually visits several pitchers during the off season to, catch up on a bullpen and just catch up on them personally. I know Chad Mottola does some of the same stuff with some of the position players locally. And so I think all of that has happened again. And I hope all of that matters, because I do think that some of the things that we saw in 21 were not the norm, and hopefully a normal off season. And we haven't had, we are going to be split in spring training for, Orlando for part and St. Pete for part, but on the major league side. But I think that at least it will be a normal 6-week spring training that's supposed to head into a normal regular season. While some of the rules are changed, I think this year will probably be more normal than any we've had in the last 4 seasons.
Right. And that's a good point about the lasting impacts of that lockout last year, because they really kind of, like you said, they hurt the players' ability to, get their work in. The team couldn't contact them or stay in contact. So yeah, I think things are looking good moving forward. I know, some people are disappointed about the lack of movement in the free agent or trade market, but overall, this is a solid core that they're returning, a solid group of guys. It's almost the same team from the 2021 season where they were great. Very similar pitching staff to last year when they were phenomenal. So yeah, I don't really see, unless there are a bunch of crazy injuries again, but I don't really see the team taking a step back, with Mike Zunino with his thoracic outlet on a non-throwing shoulder. Like, that was weird. Brandon Lau's back thing, I don't believe he's had back issues before. The hamate thing with Wander is a freak thing that, happens to guys sometimes, but he seemed like he was making a pretty decent recovery towards the end of the year, and the reports on him are good now. So yeah, I'm really optimistic and excited about this season, but I also kind of learned myself that the goal isn't to try to win 100 games every year, and I don't think we should expect that. It would be nice if they do it, but the goal is to make the postseason and keep, their main guys healthy and keep the team intact. And add at the margins. And if we get some overperformance at the margins, kind of like we did with Harold Ramirez and Isaac Paredes, who have worked themselves into a significant role with the team. But if we can get, a couple guys to hit on the fringes of the roster and this core is still solid, I think we're looking at a really good team.
Right. And I think the goal is, I think Eric and Neander and Peter Bendix have been pretty clear. The goal is now to win a World Series. And, I think it's okay to be disappointed with anything but also have some context on what happens during the course of the year. To win a World Series, you need health. To win a World Series, you probably need some guys to take steps forward. And I think that probably goes for every team, not just the Rays. Even the Yankees, they're chance that they have a very young shortstop and a very young left fielder this year and more youth on the position player side than they've had. They cover that, and they've got a lot of changes in their bullpen. So they will need guys to take fairly significant steps forward to get where they want to go. Some teams may not have that same need in terms of their young players as much as the Rays, but all teams are going to need someone to take steps forward for them to get to that last game.
Right. And I know the postseason is another thing in itself too, where, it's not necessarily the best team that makes it to the World Series. It's the team that's playing the best when the postseason comes. So it's a relatively small sample size when you compare it to the 162 games that we get in the regular season. So, as much as we love the Cinderella runs in the postseason, and I think it's probably the most exciting, form of playoffs in pro sports. There's a lot of variance involved. So, getting there is one thing, but then once you're in, you kind of just got to ride that wave. And unfortunately, the Rays weren't able to ride it last year when, getting knocked out in the first round, but anything can happen once they're in. So, health permitting, I think they've got a pretty good shot at the World Series.
Well, last year, I thought Houston was the hottest team and the best team. I thought they were both. I thought in the National League, Philadelphia was the hottest team in the National League. I don't think they were the best team, but they ended up as the team in the World Series. When the Rays faced the Dodgers in 20, I thought the Dodgers were the best team and the hottest team. I thought the Rays had to go through the gauntlet. They went through Toronto, the Yankees, and Houston to get to that point, which was quite a run. Their record was really good. They were 40-20. It was hard to say whether they were the record-wise and result-wise, they ended up as the best team. But I thought, like in that World Series, I thought the Dodgers were the hotter and the better team. And there are some years, like the Kansas City years, I can't say that they were the best team in the league in those years, but they ended up in 2 World Series and won one of them. So I think it's going to vary from year to year. The year that Atlanta won, they were not the best team. They were the hottest team. So it's going to vary from year to year. Sometimes it's one and the same. Sometimes it's just one. But at the end of the day, it's all about finding a way to win that last game.
Right. No, that's definitely true. So with the expanded playoffs too, I think it adds a little more variance, another wrinkle to all this. So it's going to be pretty exciting to see, who's the last one in and who's the first one out in the postseason. Like, can the great teams, sustain a run long enough and stay healthy long enough to make it to that World Series and win it. So maybe the Rays can just win 120 games, get a nice bye, and then we don't have to worry about it too much with all that variance.
Who knows? Look, in 21, the Rays were the best team in the American League, and then they had a bye and it didn't work out because they lost to Boston. So, and you could argue the same, like Philadelphia last year got in as a wild card, and their first game, they were trailing going into the 9th inning in St. Louis, and then the floodgates open with miscues, with weird bounces, with all kinds of stuff that all of a sudden worked in Philly's favor. They end up winning that game and they go on the great run. What if that 9th inning, the bounces don't go their way? And, then we're talking about, somebody else in the World Series. I think, the Cleveland Rays series was so close and so tight. I can think of countless plays that could have turned that whole series, that short series on its end. The play that Jose Ramirez made at third base to take away a a Margot RBI infield hit that could have been the difference in a game and sent us to a deciding third, but it didn't happen. And so, there are very, very slim margins for all of these games and all of these series. And especially when you're talking best of 3, best of 5, even best of 7, I tend to believe the longer you go, the better team or the hotter team will usually win. Sometimes it's both. But still, the smallest of margins can change everything. Even in the Kansas City year, they had a wild comeback in a wild card game in one of those World Series years against Oakland. And everything kind of fell in their favor in that moment. Sometimes it's just meant to be, and players make plays. And ultimately, it is always the players that decide it. I think we talk a lot about front offices and managers and coaches, but, really good teams, World Series teams usually have really good players. And I think the Rays have really good players, and it's a matter of how well they play this year.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to put it. And I think it's a nice way to wrap this up. Like, the good players play good, the bad players, sometimes they play good, sometimes they don't. But having as many good players as you can is always a great thing. So I think that's what the Rays are doing here. I think they've got a lot of really good players, and I think that's hopefully going to manifest itself in a World Series, maybe this year. Who knows? It would be great. But yeah, thank you so much. Oh yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. This was fantastic. I feel like my brain expanded a little bit. It got another wrinkle. Some more neurons are firing across the synapses or whatever. Is there anything you want to share or plug? Like, we don't have only Rays listeners at RBLR. We've got, the Bucks, the Rowdies, the Lightning. So where can people find your stuff and like and subscribe to what you do?
Well, the easy part is I think I'm probably most active for a fan on Twitter, at Neil Solondz. And if you can spell that, all the more power to you. For those of you who are watching the video, it's easier. I would say that you also can find all our content on our blog, raysradio.mlblogs.com. Our podcasts can be found on This Week in Rays Baseball on Apple, on Spotify, raysbaseball.com/radio, or wherever you happen to listen, or raysbaseball.com/podcast. Any of those areas are ways to get our material. And, we'll have a lot of content off season, and we also do a lot of content spring training and in season. So check it out, and we appreciate you having us.
Yeah, thank you again for coming on. For our regular listeners, totally forgot to do the ad plug or whatever I always do. So buy a shirt, shop.rblrsports.com. I was too much in my own head here, too excited about everything we're talking about. It's a great conversation, but yeah, use that promo code FLAPPY, FLAPPY, 10% off your order. Look as good as me and Neil here. And just like, subscribe, share what we do. And I think that's it. I'm getting the music that we're wrapping up here. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and go Rays.
Thank you for tuning into this presentation by RBLR Sports. On your way out of the stadium, please remember to like and subscribe.